The realization. September 1945, aboard a U.S. Navy transport docked at Pearl Harbor. The war was over. The rising sun had set. Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi stood silently on the deck, the Pacific wind brushing the edges of his uniform, now stripped of its insignia. Around him, a small group of Japanese officers, once proud commanders of the Imperial Navy, stared in silence at what lay before them. Not guns, not ships, not soldiers, but oil. Endless oil. Stretching across the harbor were row after row of massive cylindrical storage tanks, metal giants rising from the earth like industrial mountains. Some gleamed silver under the Hawaiian sun, others were blackened by age, each one capable of holding millions of barrels of crude. The air itself carried a faint petroleum tang, sharp and heavy, clinging to the nose. A young U.S. Navy lieutenant, crisp in his khakis, gestured toward the horizon. "Gentlemen," he said with a tight smile, "this is just one of our fuel depots. We have dozens more like it along the coast. And that doesn't include the mainland." Onishi didn't reply. He didn't need to. His eyes did the work, tracing the line of tanks as they vanished into the distance. For years, Japan had fought a war powered by desperation, scraping together what little oil it could find from occupied territories, rationing every drop for aircraft and ships. Every sortie, every convoy, every kamikaze run was fueled by oil bought in blood. And yet, here before him, was enough fuel to power the entire Imperial Navy for decades. The silence among the Japanese delegation grew heavier. Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, once commander of the Fourth Fleet, turned to Onishi. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "If we had seen this before the war," he murmured, "we would never have begun it." The American officer nodded slightly, as if understanding. "That's what Admiral Nimitz wanted you to see," he said. "We didn't beat Japan just with weapons. We beat her with supply." In the distance, cranes unloaded cargo ships stacked with barrels, each drum marked Standard Oil Company, California. Tankers moved in and out of the harbor in a mechanical rhythm, feeding the arteries of a nation that seemed infinite in resources. Onishi's mind drifted back to 1941, to the secret meetings in Tokyo, where Japan's high command had debated the war's course. The question had always been the same. Could Japan fight a long war against the United States? The answer, whispered even then, had been no. But pride, ambition, and illusion had drowned out logic. Now, surrounded by this industrial colossus, there was no illusion left. He pictured the small oil tanks back in Yokosuka, the narrow refineries of Formosa, the seized fields in Sumatra, the convoys hunted across the Pacific by American submarines. Each time one went down, Japan's strength leaked into the ocean. And here stood the empire that never ran dry. A U.S. officer handed the Japanese delegation a printed report. U.S. oil production, 1944. He explained. Over 1 billion barrels. Your nation's entire wartime consumption, all branches combined, was about 20 million. Onishi took the paper in his hands. The numbers blurred, not from poor printing, but from something deep inside him. The slow realization that every Japanese plane that fell, every destroyer sunk, every island lost, had already been decided before a single shot was fired. War, he thought, was not a contest of bravery. It was a contest of endurance. And Japan had run out of endurance long before it admitted defeat. As the Americans led them down the dock, the Admiral's boots clicked softly against the steel. The same Pacific that once glittered with the flags of the Imperial Navy now carried only U.S. convoys. He could almost hear the sound of those tankers humming, the heartbeat of victory, powered not by courage, but by oil. He turned once more toward the endless rows of tanks and whispered, This was our enemy all along. The illusion of power. December 1941. Tokyo. The room was dim, filled with cigarette smoke and the quiet shuffle of documents. The Imperial General Headquarters was a fortress of polished wood and shadow, where confidence often passed for strategy. Around the table sat the men who believed they could reshape the Pacific. At the head of the table was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Calm, sharp-eyed, his uniform immaculate, he knew better than most what they were about to attempt. Having studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, Yamamoto had seen America's industrial muscle up close. He'd driven past refineries that stretched for miles, seen trains carrying oil tankers longer than any Japanese convoy. He'd once joked to an American friend that if Japan went to war with the United States, I shall run wild for 6 months. After that, I can guarantee nothing. Now, those words hung like a silent prophecy. The minister spoke in clipped tones. Figures, maps, logistics. Japan had oil reserves for barely 2 years of war, even with strict rationing. The invasion of the Dutch East Indies was meant to solve that, to seize the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra, to keep the Navy and the Zero fighters alive. But everyone in the room knew the truth. Those wells would never be enough. Still, pride and desperation made a dangerous mix. Admiral Nagano traced a finger across a map of the Pacific. If we strike hard, he said, the Americans will lose their will to fight. We must destroy their fleet before their industry wakes. Yamamoto didn't look up. Their industry, he said softly, is already awake. But no one wanted to hear it. Japan's empire stretched across Asia. Victories in China, Indochina, and Manchuria had created the illusion of invincibility. The newspapers called it the New Order in East Asia. The people believed it. Even the emperor believed it. And so on December 7th, 1941, Japan gambled everything. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a masterpiece of precision. 6 carriers, 350 aircraft, and a plan executed with terrifying efficiency. Within hours, the pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay burning. Columns of smoke twisted into the Hawaiian sky like funeral banners. In Tokyo, people wept with joy. But Yamamoto didn't celebrate. From his flagship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay, he received the coded confirmation of success and fell silent. Officers around him cheered. He poured himself a cup of tea. He knew the truth. Japan had woken a sleeping giant. Behind that moment of triumph, oil already dictated the future. Every Japanese plane that flew that morning had burned irreplaceable fuel. Every carrier that returned to port would need thousands of barrels to sail again. And the empire's captured oil fields, far to the south, were months away from being fully operational. Yamamoto stared out across the dark waters. He could already feel the weight of what was coming. The slow, grinding machine of American industry. The factories that could replace every lost ship, every downed plane, every bullet fired. Japan, by comparison, was running on fumes. In the months that followed, the illusion of power began to crack. Japan's naval victories at the Coral Sea and early in the Philippines came at enormous cost. Pilots lost faster than they could be trained. Carriers damaged beyond repair. Each success drank from the same shrinking reservoir of oil. By 1943, Japanese tankers were being hunted relentlessly by U.S. submarines. The sea lanes that once fed the empire's war machine became graveyards. Oil convoys from Sumatra and Borneo never arrived. Destroyers sat in harbor, grounded for lack of fuel. Training flights were reduced to a few minutes each. And yet, the official reports to Tokyo remained optimistic. Charts and speeches spoke of temporary shortages, strategic redeployments. inevitable hardship before victory. But Yamamoto knew what the admirals at Pearl Harbor would one day see with their own eyes. The truth no one wanted to speak aloud. You cannot win a modern war without oil. He wrote it once, privately, in a note never meant to be read by history. The spirit of the samurai cannot power a ship. The courage of a pilot cannot lift an aircraft without fuel. He folded the letter and locked it away. Perhaps, deep down, he already knew the outcome. The war machine awakens. 1942, Washington, D.C. The morning sun poured through the windows of the War Production Board. Outside, trucks roared through the streets, carrying steel, rubber, and barrels of crude oil. Inside, America was building something no one, not even Yamamoto, could have fully imagined. An industrial war engine without equal. Men in suits bent over maps of refineries and transport routes. The war wasn't being won on the front lines yet. It was being won here, in the blueprints and spreadsheets, in the relentless hum of factories. By mid-1942, the United States was producing over 6 million barrels of oil per day. The numbers were staggering. Numbers that didn't exist in any Japanese calculation. Texas, California, and Oklahoma became the beating heart of the Allied war effort. In the Gulf of Mexico, pipelines pumped day and night. In the deserts of California, new wells were drilled faster than Japan could sink a ship. Oil refineries burned like miniature suns on the horizon. Steel giants turning black crude into the blood of modern war. Aviation fuel, diesel, lubricants, asphalt. On the other side of the world, Japan's intelligence service watched helplessly. Reports flowed into Tokyo. Coded telegrams describing the pace of American shipbuilding and fuel output. At first, the numbers were dismissed as propaganda. Then came confirmation. By 1943, the U.S. had built more tankers than Japan had aircraft carriers. Every day, convoys left the U.S. mainland, stretching from the west coast to Australia, to the Solomon Islands, to the Persian Gulf. Oil flowed like a river that could never run dry. In contrast, Japan's empire was running out of breath. The refineries in Sumatra and Borneo were operational but primitive, unable to meet demand. Allied bombing raids targeted storage depots. Submarines patrolled the South China Sea, sinking tankers faster than Japan could replace them. A Japanese destroyer captain later recalled, "We rationed fuel like water in the desert. Every sortie meant choosing which ship would move and which would remain anchored forever." Back in Tokyo, the High Command held endless meetings. Charts of reserves were drawn and redrawn. Officers spoke in euphemisms. Critical shortages, logistical difficulties. But everyone in the room understood what those phrases really meant. The empire was starving. Meanwhile, in America, oil wasn't just a resource. It was abundance weaponized. At a refinery in Baytown, Texas, engineers joked that they were fighting the war from the pump. Every time a new batch of aviation fuel rolled out, it meant more bombers in the sky, more tanks rolling through North Africa, more carriers cutting across the Pacific. The difference between the two nations could be seen from space, if satellites had existed. Japan's fuel map was a scattering of fragile dots. America's was a solid ocean of production. Even German officers, when visiting Japan in 1943, were stunned. One Luftwaffe attaché wrote privately to Berlin, "They have courage, yes, but they fight with buckets against a flood." And still, Japan refused to admit defeat. The spirit of Bushido demanded endurance beyond reason. Factories turned to synthetic fuels. Civilians donated cooking oil to the army. Training planes ran on alcohol mixtures. Pilots prayed before takeoff not only for victory, but for enough fuel to make it home. But the tide was turning faster than anyone in Tokyo could manage. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, once crippled at Pearl Harbor, was now an unstoppable armada fueled by rivers of oil. Carriers like the Enterprise and Essex crossed thousands of miles without slowing. Battleships that once sat in ruins were reborn, their tanks filled to the brim. And for every gallon the Americans spent, 10 more were waiting in reserve. War had become mathematics, and Japan's numbers no longer added up. As one captured Japanese staff officer would later admit, "We believed in the courage of men. The Americans believed in the power of machines. In the end, machines do not tire." The empire that had once seemed unstoppable was now being suffocated not by bombs or bullets, but by simple arithmetic. The collapse of supply. Summer 1944. The South China Sea. The ocean was quiet. Too quiet. The Japanese oil tanker Nisho Maru cut slowly through the waves, its engines sputtering, its holds only half full. Somewhere below deck, the chief engineer muttered a prayer, not for safety, but for fuel. Every voyage now was a gamble. The sea, once dominated by the Imperial Navy, had turned into a hunting ground patrolled by American submarines. Hours later, the periscope of USS Seahorse broke the surface. The tanker never saw it coming. 2 torpedoes slammed into her hull. A plume of fire rose into the sky, black smoke staining the horizon. When the flames cleared, another vital artery of Japan's war machine had been severed. By 1944, this scene was repeated almost daily. Out of every 10 tankers Japan sent to sea, 7 never returned. The country that once dreamed of ruling the Pacific was now struggling just to move its ships from one port to another. In Tokyo, the situation had become desperate. Oil reserves were nearly gone. Entire naval task forces were immobilized. Battleships sat anchored, majestic but useless, floating monuments to a dying empire. The mighty Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, was often left idling in harbor, unable to sail for lack of fuel. Officers joked bitterly that the world's largest battleship had become the world's most expensive hotel. Every sector of Japan's war effort was unraveling. Aircraft production slowed, then stopped. Pilots trained on wooden planes because metal was too precious, and fuel was too rare to waste. One flight instructor wrote in his journal, "We now teach combat maneuvers by drawing them in the air with our hands." Factories that once roared with the sound of engines fell silent. Railways slowed to a crawl. Even the trucks delivering food to cities ran on fumes. Civilians walked to work. Rice was transported by bicycles. The Japanese Empire was starving, not just for food, but for energy itself. In the Pacific Islands, soldiers began to notice the change too. On Guadalcanal, veterans recalled that their supply ships simply stopped coming. Fuel drums were rationed, then locked away. Generators fell silent. Without power, radios died. The jungle swallowed their presence. Entire units were cut off, forgotten, fading into the green silence of defeat. In Burma, Japanese divisions fought with what little remained, dragging artillery by hand through the mud. In the Philippines, aircraft that couldn't fly were buried or burned to prevent capture. The empire's reach had shrunk to the size of its last fuel depot. Admiral Toyota, now commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, wrote in his 1944 diary, "The oil question is not a matter of supply. It is a matter of existence. Without it, we are finished." He wasn't exaggerating. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the Americans were accelerating. Oil tankers refueled fleets at sea, turning the U.S. Navy into a mobile fortress. Destroyers no longer returned to port for resupply. Fuel ships came to them. It was a level of logistical mastery Japan could never match. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, while Japanese carriers struggled to launch what few aircraft they had left, American ships operated for weeks without pause. The contrast was almost absurd. The Imperial Navy, once feared across the Pacific, was now paralyzed not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. When U.S. intelligence intercepted Japanese communications describing fuel shortages, one admiral dryly remarked, "We don't need to sink their ships anymore. They're sinking themselves." By the end of 1944, the math was brutal. Japan's entire crude oil production, from occupied territories, synthetic plants, and reserves, totaled less than what the U.S. could refine in a single week. The empire was collapsing in slow motion. Every explosion, every burning tanker, every grounded plane was a reminder that the war was no longer about who fought harder, but who could still move. And Japan could not. In January 1945, Admiral Somu Toyota issued an order to the surviving fleet. Every ship that can move will move. Every man who can fight will fight. What he didn't say aloud, what everyone already knew, was that there would be no fuel to bring them home. The empire burns out. April 7th, 1945, off the coast of Kyushu. The sea was black with smoke. On the horizon, the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was dying. Her engines strained, her fuel tanks nearly dry. She was making her final voyage, Operation Tengo, a desperate suicide mission ordered by Tokyo. The plan was simple and hopeless. Sail south to Okinawa, beach the ship, and turn her guns into a fortress. There wasn't even enough fuel for a return trip. On the bridge, Captain Aruga Kosaku stood in silence. He knew every man aboard, over 3,000 souls, had already been written off. Around him, sailors stared at gauges that barely flickered. The Yamato's massive turbines drank oil faster than the Empire could supply it. The ship was a symbol of Japan's might and its madness. Then came the sound, a low hum, distant at first, then swelling. The sound of engines, hundreds of them. The sky darkened. American carrier planes, Avengers, Helldivers, Corsairs, swarmed in from every direction. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns thundered, tracers cutting through the air, but the sky was too full. Bombs fell. Torpedoes hit her broadside. Columns of water and fire erupted higher than the masts. Hours later, as she capsized and exploded, the shockwave rolled across the sea. The pride of the Imperial Navy vanished in a single flash. A fireball fueled by the last drops of Japan's oil. It was more than the death of a ship. It was the death of an idea. The illusion that courage could replace fuel, that spirit could defeat supply. Back in Tokyo, as reports of Yamato's loss reached the Admiralty, Admiral Somu Toyota closed his eyes. The room was silent except for the drone of distant bombers over the city. He spoke quietly to his staff. The fleet has ceased to exist as a fighting force. The rest is endurance. Endurance, but of what? By mid-1945, Japan was an empty shell. Cities burned nightly under B-29 firebombing. Refineries were rubble. Rail lines lay twisted and broken. Oil drums were replaced by wooden barrels filled with hopes that never arrived. Factories converted to hand tools and bicycles. The Air Force, once proud, flew only in bursts, sending inexperienced pilots on one-way missions. Young men took off knowing they would never return, their planes barely reaching altitude before stalling. The Empire was starving not just for food, but for motion. The wheels of war had stopped turning, and then came the bombs. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The final symbols of a war powered by technology, by science, by resources beyond measure. When Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people on August 15th, his voice was calm but hollow. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he said. A line so understated, it almost sounded absurd. Behind those words lay the truth. The empire had burned out. In the weeks that followed, Japan's officers were taken into custody. Many were silent, some defiant, others broken, and among them were admirals who had once planned the empire's expansion, now reduced to prisoners staring at the scale of their defeat. They were shown the evidence, the fuel reports, the supply lines, the maps of American oil production, photos of refineries that could produce more in a day than Japan could in a year. And for the first time, they saw the war from the outside, not as warriors, but as witnesses to inevitability. One of them, Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the man who had once commanded kamikaze squadrons, is said to have whispered, "We fought with the wind, while they fought with fire." He knew what he meant. Oil had decided the war long before the bombs ever fell. It had powered the ships that carried the troops, the planes that bombed the cities, the factories that forged the weapons. It had turned America's industrial base into something elemental, a tide no empire could resist. And when that tide finally reached Japan's shores, it swept away everything. In the months after surrender, captured officers stood before endless rows of U.S. oil tanks. The same scene Admiral Onishi would never forget. Silver giants stretching to the horizon, each one holding more power than all of Japan's remaining navy. No speeches were given, no words exchanged, just silence. Onishi stared at them for a long time and murmured, "This is what defeat looks like." Lessons in Fuel and Fire. Autumn 1945. Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. The docks were quiet now. Once, they had echoed with the clang of hammers and the roar of engines. Now only the gulls called across the harbor, circling over rusting ships that would never sail again. Rear Admiral Masataka Kimura stood near the dry dock, his uniform faded, his rank meaningless. He looked out at the skeletons of ships, destroyers stripped of guns, cruisers half sunken in oil-stained water. The smell of rust and salt hung heavy in the air. An American officer approached, offering him a cigarette. Kimura accepted it silently. The match flared. Small, bright, fleeting. "You know," the American said, exhaling smoke, "when the war started, we were burning through oil faster than we could count. We thought you'd hit our supply lines. You never did." Kimura managed a faint smile. "We tried," he said softly, "but the sea was too big, and your tanks were endless." In the months after Japan's surrender, teams of Allied officers toured what was left of the empire. They saw factories without power, trains stranded on empty tracks, airfields littered with aircraft that had never flown. The war's ruin wasn't just in its dead, it was in its silence. The Americans understood what had happened long before the Japanese did. Japan hadn't simply lost a military contest. It had lost a war of logistics, a war of oil. Every mile of Pacific Ocean crossed by a carrier group had been measured in barrels of fuel. Every bombing raid, every invasion, every sortie, all powered by the same thing that now sat dormant in the U.S. tanks at Pearl Harbor. A single American refinery could outproduce Japan's entire empire. Texas alone could have fueled the war by itself. In the end, the Pacific War hadn't been a clash of empires. It had been a contest between an island of ambition and a continent of resources. When the Japanese delegation was later shown photographs of U.S. production, oil wells stretching to the horizon, refineries glowing like cities at night, trains hauling fuel tankers across the plains, the room went silent. Admiral Nagano, who had once argued for war, stared at the images and said almost to himself, "We were blind." We measured courage, not capacity. The Americans didn't gloat. They didn't need to. The numbers spoke louder than any victory parade. In a report compiled after the war, U.S. Navy intelligence summed it up bluntly. Japanese defeat was inevitable from the moment their oil supply was cut off. The empire ran on borrowed fuel, and the debt came due. The war in the Pacific was a story of bravery on both sides. But bravery couldn't refill a tank. Pilots who fought to the last, sailors who never turned back, commanders who refused to surrender. All of them had faced an enemy they couldn't see: arithmetic. Behind every bomb dropped on Tokyo, every ship launched at Pearl Harbor, every jeep that rolled across Iwo Jima, there was the same invisible force: oil, the world's new weapon, the true currency of power. By 1946, Japan's fuel reserves were gone, its navy was dissolved. Its cities, rebuilt with American steel and oil, rose again, this time powered by the very thing that had once defeated it. And yet, among the surviving admirals, there remained a quiet respect for the lesson learned too late. When asked years later what had truly ended the war, one former officer said, "It was not the bomb. Not even the fleet. It was the barrels. The endless barrels." He paused, his gaze distant, the faint smell of diesel still somewhere in memory. "We thought we were fighting men, but we were fighting a machine, and machines, when fed, do not stop." So when Admiral Onishi looked across the American fuel depots and whispered, "This was our enemy all along," he wasn't just speaking of the United States. He was naming the truth of modern war, that no matter the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of commanders, victory belongs to those who can endure. Oil was endurance made liquid, and by 1945, Japan had none left. The empire didn't just fall, it ran out of fuel.